As a family historian, I'm fascinated by how much detail Jane Austen actually scatters through Sense and Sensibility to reveal more about the life and the upbringing of the overlooked, mysterious, well-travelled soldier, Colonel Brandon. Unflatteringly described as the wrong side of 5 and 30, as indeed am I. Marianne Dashwood, who then is only 17, dismisses him as old enough to be my father. A social acquaintance of Mrs. Jennings, he is friends with Sir John Middleton. The friendship between the Colonel and Sir John seems to predate Sir John's marriage to Mary Jennings. Mrs. Jennings had been anxious to see Colonel Brandon well married ever since. Charlotte Palmer, Mrs. Jennings' younger daughter, confirms that her family have known Colonel Brandon since Mary got married. He was a particular friend of Sir John's. We never meet the wider Brandon family, but thanks to Mrs. Jennings' tendency to gossip, you can pull all the details together by looking into just how Colonel Brandon ends up inheriting the family home. The Colonel is a man of very good property in Dorsetshire. Delaford House and the surrounding estate has been inherited by Colonel Brandon from his brother. Based on the general laws of inheritance, Colonel Brandon must be the second eldest of at least 2 brothers. The elder Brandon brother must have died without any living heirs. Otherwise, Delaford would just have gone to Colonel Brandon's nephew, probably, not to Colonel Brandon himself. A nice old-fashioned place, quite shut in with great garden walls that are covered with the best fruit trees in the country, and such a mulberry tree in one corner, a dovecote, some delightful stew ponds, and a very pretty canal, close to the church and only a mile from the turnpike road. You can go and sit up in an old yew arbour behind the house, where you may see all the carriages that pass along. And there's a butcher hard by in the village, the parsonage house within a stone's throw. It's in a really convenient location for travel. Everything is where it needs to be in relation to Delaford. By the time Mrs. Jennings tells us all about this, we can also guess that Colonel Brandon has at least one married sister. Earlier on in chapter 12, we have heard that he has a living brother-in-law who owned a very fine place about 12 miles from Barton, where the Dashwoods moved to, in a place called Whitwell. That is where they are supposed to have a day out that doesn't quite go according to plan in chapter 12. In chapter 13, a mysterious note prompts Mrs. Jennings to speculate that Colonel Brandon has received this note from his sister in Avignon. This sister apparently is in poor health. She also speculates that maybe it's from Colonel Brandon's cousin Fanny, who is unmarried but seems likely to be engaged in the near future. If we assume that the sister in Avignon is not the same sister who marries the man with the house at Whitwell, this suggests that Colonel Brandon must be one of 4 children. That already gives us enough to create a family tree. When Colonel Brandon was a child, his father took into the family home, which must have been at Delaford, one of his nearest relations, a girl named Eliza. She was about the same age as him, and she was in line to inherit a large fortune. Brandon describes his father as Eliza's uncle and guardian, in view of the fact that Eliza has a sizable fortune. Maybe this is the child of an elder brother in the Brandon family in the earlier generation. The fact that Brandon Sr. has taken on guardianship of Eliza seems to imply that one or both of her parents are dead. already we can add another generation. Eliza and Brandon seem to be about the same age. When they were around 17, having fallen in love, they were all set to elope to Scotland. Unfortunately, their plan was discovered. Eliza was instead forced to marry Colonel Brandon's elder brother, who was then still the heir to Delaford, because frankly the family needed her money. At this stage in the proceedings, the future Colonel Brandon is only the younger brother. The older brother is therefore the one that really needs Eliza's money. If you know the 1995 film adaptation of Sense and Sensibility, you will know that a lot of this backstory gets changed. Mrs. Jennings says that Eliza and Brandon are forbidden to marry because she was poor. Actually, she had quite a big fortune. A lot had to be cut out and simplified just to get the film down to a more reasonable 2-hour length of time. The upshot being that Brandon was then banished to the house of a relation. Shortly afterwards, he joined the army. Not long after this, his father, Mr. Brandon, dies, which then allows us to amend the family tree once again. What happens next? About 2 years after Eliza and elder brother Brandon get married, they end up getting divorced, which is quite a thing in that time. It is implied that Eliza starts an affair with another man, essentially because her husband doesn't really care about her. Colonel Brandon, meanwhile, has been dispatched to the East Indies. He was there somewhere between 1777, 78 and maybe 1783 at the latest, which is actually a nice way to bring in a bit of Jane Austen's own family history. When Colonel Brandon would have been in the East Indies, the first Governor-General of Bengal was one Warren Hastings. Warren Hastings also developed the East India Company and made it into a much bigger organisation than it had been previously. Unfortunately, Hastings' methods of government were not necessarily approved of by all. He ended up on trial, charged with corruption, and was ultimately acquitted in 1795. So all of this is roughly contemporary with the backstory of Colonel Brandon. The reason I mention this is because Jane Austen and her family knew Warren Hastings. It was rumoured that Jane's first cousin Eliza Hancock, who herself had been born in India in 1761, may have been Warren Hastings' biological daughter. Maybe when Jane Austen was piecing together the backstory of Colonel Brandon, looking into the reasons why he's presented at the beginning of the novel as a man in his mid-30s who for some reason has not yet got married even though he has got a nice estate of his own, she picked inspiration from within her own family. I am not a military historian. I'm no real authority on these sorts of records. But I do know that the genealogist's website holds some 18th century army lists. If Colonel Brandon's family was from Dorset, could I find any regiments from the southwest of England or even the south of England? So is there anything I could pull out to identify potential regiments that he might have joined? Using the army lists for March of 1788, I learnt that the 17th, 19th, 20th, 21st and 22nd Dragoons had been disbanded or reduced between 1783 and 1785, which roughly corresponds with Colonel Brandon's approximate return to England. The 1st Foot 1st and 2nd Regiments and the 2nd Foot to 104th Foot Regiments were also disbanded. Of some of these, I was at least able to discount the 20th Light Dragoons. Between 1779 and 1783, they were employed on the coast of East Anglia, policing the operations of smugglers, so it sounds like they didn't actually ever leave England. On balance, it is very likely that Jane Austen has fictionalised some aspects of the story, so the real historical records are not necessarily going to match the exact details in the novel. I think she was very careful not to link storylines to actual serving regiments. However, I will say that the Families in British India Society have got a whole host of resources on their website relating to military records for the East India Company regiments and other army lists, there's pensions and all sorts of other related databases. So I do highly recommend contacting them if that is something that has come into your family history and you're trying to find out more about that. There are more specialist family history societies out there that tackle these kind of things. 3 years after, Colonel Brandon returns to England. He would be about 22, 23, we're probably looking at 1783. And 6 months after his return, finally, he finds out what has happened to Eliza. He encounters her in a debtor's prison. She's in the last stage of consumption, tuberculosis. She's fallen on hard times beyond anybody's imagining. She's dying at 22, 23 perhaps. Brandon's older brother has divorced her. And Colonel Brandon helps us by saying that this painful incident occurs 14 years before he's describing all this to Eleanor Dashwood. Soon afterwards, Eliza dies. She places into the care of Colonel Brandon a little girl, the offspring of her first guilty connection, who was then about 3 years old. This little girl is the result of Eliza's extramarital relationship. Is this a clue that Brandon's brother divorces her on the grounds of adultery? It would probably be technically possible to do that, maybe expensive. There's obviously no great love between Brandon's elder brother and Eliza. I think he didn't think twice about it. The child is always referred to either as Miss Williams or Eliza Williams. Whoever her father was, and we're going to presume it must be Mr. Williams, technically speaking, if Eliza did not marry the father of her child, the baby should have taken the surname Brandon. I think that Williams is a big clue to the identity of her biological father. Brandon always calls her little Eliza. He acts as her guardian because her mother has died. He goes on to send her to school when she's old enough. But despite what Mrs. Jennings thinks, he cannot be her father. He had just been in the army in the East Indies. By the time he returns to England and he finds her mother, Eliza is already a toddler. She's been conceived and born while he's been away abroad. What this does mean is that we can now add little Eliza to the family tree. Again, by piecing together details in the novel, we can now move forward to around about 5 years before the novel begins, somewhere around the year 1792, give or take. Colonel Brandon is 32, 33 years old. His elder brother, who had inherited Delaford, dies. We can infer that the elder brother did not remarry or have further children, any children in fact, little Eliza was not his, after his divorce, because the family property then gets passed down to Colonel Brandon himself. 3 years before the time when Colonel Brandon is relaying all this backstory to Eleanor, somewhere around early 1795, little Eliza has just reached her 14th year. She's old enough to leave school. He sends her to live with a respectable woman residing in Dorsetshire who has charge of 4 or 5 other girls of a similar age. This makes perfect sense. They will have female company that is appropriate for their age, and he's probably thinking that this respectable woman knows an awful lot more about raising teenagers than he does. Straight out of the army, he's trying to work out how to run his new estate. He's not married, so he can't put Eliza in the care of any wife. This is the best solution he can find. All seems to be in order, until a year before Colonel Brandon is relaying this to Eleanor. He gives Eliza permission to go to Bath with her friend and the friend's invalid father. They're left to their own devices. In the February, Eliza, who was about 16, suddenly disappears. When you piece together the later elements of the plot, you can quickly work out at this point in time Willoughby must have been in Bath, and it is there that he seduces young Eliza. Either she runs off with him and doesn't know where to go back to, or she runs away because she realises that he has left her pregnant. Colonel Brandon doesn't know about this. All he knows at some point not long afterwards is that Eliza's disappeared. So now we move forward to the October of 1797. This is the day of the trip to Whitwell. Colonel Brandon finds out that Willoughby has left Eliza in a situation of the utmost distress, i.e. pregnant. She's got no home, no help, no friends. She doesn't know where he lives. And he goes to London. And there he finds her. How she's got to London, we don't know. Most crucially of all, she is near her delivery, so she is very close to giving birth, which would fit. Her February disappearance from Bath implies that she suspects she's pregnant around this time. The baby would be due around October or November. That fits in with what we know about biology. And what happens next is really quite dramatic. So Colonel Brandon has discovered that Eliza, his ward effectively, had been seduced by Willoughby. Within a fortnight, they met by appointment. They fought a duel. It turns out that the laws and regulations about duelling go back to the Commonwealth period. An ordinance against challenges, duels and all provocations thereunto was laid out in the June of 1654, 150 years before the time when Sense and Sensibility is set. From the 1st of July 1654, anybody who challenged another person to a duel in order to settle a quarrel, or anybody who accepts a challenge by message, word, writing or any other way, would be committed to prison without bail, held for 6 months until the next general quarter sessions of the peace, or the general assize and jail delivery to be held for that county, city or town. Any person or persons who actually fight any duel or combat upon such preceding challenge or appointment as aforesaid shall act as a second, or otherwise knowingly accompany or assist such a person, every such offender and offenders to be banished during life out of this Commonwealth. So effectively you are being exiled from Britain as it existed in the 1650s. The local justices of the peace were allowed to specify the date and port of your departure. Typically you would be expected to leave within a month of sentence, but that was in the 1650s. We are getting closer in time to 1804 when Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton had their duel. This is their time. By the late 1770s, the pistol had become a very popular weapon of choice for the Regency duelling gentlemen, especially in England. Although, technically speaking, duelling was not allowed, it was however considered an appropriate way for the aggrieved gentleman to defend their honour or the honour of a family member, which I suppose is what Colonel Brandon is doing here. So when Brandon comments in Sense and Sensibility that neither he nor Willoughby was wounded in the altercation, and so the duel remained a secret, it makes you wonder, what were they armed with? Swords or pistols? If the second, did they both deliberately fire to miss? That would be a way of satisfying honour without anybody actually getting hurt. Eliza, who cannot be more than 17, survives childbirth, and as soon as she recovers from her lying in, Colonel Brandon moves her and the baby into the country, in the area where he's living. Young Eliza never does marry the baby's father. Shortly afterwards, John Willoughby marries the very wealthy Sophia Gray. We can adjust the family tree once again. As if this duelling wasn't enough to worry about, around about March of 1798, Colonel Brandon is told that the living of Delaford has become vacant. In other words, the local vicar has either died or possibly retired. And this is relevant. The parsonage, where the vicar lives, is almost close to the mansion house where Colonel Brandon lives. It's quite a modest place. The late incumbent, I believe, did not make more than £200 per annum. Colonel Brandon, strangely enough, like Lady Catherine de Bourgh in Pride and Prejudice, has the right to give this living to whoever he likes. Colonel Brandon chooses Edward Ferrars, who he actually doesn't know all that well at all, socially or otherwise. So why would he choose Edward? First, he is aware that Edward does genuinely want to become a vicar, even though that vocation is nowhere near glamorous enough to please his very wealthy family. Edward is also friends with the very sensible Eleanor Dashwood. Colonel Brandon seems to respect her judgment, so that is another point in Edward's favour. Thirdly, and most critically, Edward has just been disinherited by his very wealthy mother because he will not break his engagement to the impoverished Lucy Steele. And the Colonel comment on this in chapter 39 is rather revealing. The cruelty, the impolitic cruelty, he replied with great feeling, of dividing or attempting to divide two young people long attached to each other is terrible. Mrs. Ferrars does not know what she may be doing, what she may drive her son to. Does the Colonel maybe see a parallel between his younger self and Edward? His father, Mr. Brandon, did not care that he was in love with the older Eliza when he forced her to marry Colonel Brandon's elder brother. in order that the Brandon family could have and enjoy Eliza's fortune. Similarly, Mrs. Ferrers is trying to force her elder son Edward to give up Lucy Steele because she wants him to marry the wealthy Miss Morton and bring that fortune into the family. There's a lot of financial pressure going on here. In Edward's case, Lucy likes the Ferrers' money far more than she likes Edward, and when Mrs. Ferrers disinherits him in favour of his younger brother Robert, Lucy just follows the money and marries Robert, which leaves Edward free to declare his love for Eleanor Dashwood, and they get married, and after a little bit of renovation work they move into the parsonage at Delaford. They become neighbours with Colonel Brandon, and Edward becomes vicar of the parish. After nearly dying from a fever, Marianne Dashwood, Eleanor's younger sister, begins to move on from her teenage romantic phase. She is sobered to realise just how miserable her family would have been had she pined away and starved herself to death. Instead, Marianne gets this zest for life and starts to want to enjoy the world around her. She lays out her plans with great enthusiasm. We will walk to Sir John's new plantations at Barton Cross and the Abbey land, and we will often go to the ruins of the old priory and try to trace its foundations as far as we are told they once reached. Neither will Marianne be lying in bed, never to be later in writing than 6, and from that time till dinner I shall divide every moment between music and reading. I have formed my plan and I'm determined to enter onto a serious course of study. How does she see Colonel Brandon? She is a couple of years older, he is a couple of years older. In chapter 8, Marianne had described the Colonel as old enough to be my father, as I said, only just. Now, however, she's starting to respect his life experience. Also his library. There are many works well worth reading at the park, that is Sir John Middleton's house, Barton Park, and there are others of more modern production which I know I can borrow of Colonel Brandon, so this is a man who likes to keep his library up to date with the latest titles. By reading only 6 hours a day, I shall gain in the course of a 12-month a great deal of instruction which I now feel myself to want. She wants to improve herself intellectually, I suppose. And more importantly, Marianne understands Colonel Brandon's history. She also now comprehends that Willoughby seduced young Eliza, who after all is probably only a year younger than herself. So her respect for the Colonel is increasing. After all, considering what this positively ancient 37-year-old ex-soldier Colonel Brandon has been through, I think she realises that he has got hidden depths. Think about it. He was separated from his first love, Eliza, and he was packed off to join the army. Eliza is forced to marry his elder brother, who didn't care about her, so she found someone who did. For that, his brother divorced her. Colonel Brandon travels the world, he comes back again, he finds Eliza, but this time she is dying of TB, which is, the typically romantic poet cliche, which is just the kind of thing that Marianne was into. Having seen Eliza die, he then looks out for her illegitimate child, little Eliza. He brings her up as if she was his own. He takes on guardianship of Eliza, and when little Eliza grows up and the roguish Willoughby seduces her and leaves her unmarried and pregnant, not only does Colonel Brandon look after her, Colonel Brandon actually goes as far as to challenge Willoughby to a duel. That's quite a tumultuous life story. Some people would say that Jane Austen married Marianne off to Colonel Brandon because it's a convenient way to tie up the loose ends. I'm not so sure. Colonel Brandon's backstory is full of all the things that Marianne expects from her romantic hero. They were both very passionate characters, I think. Probably Colonel Brandon represses this side of himself because of his youthful experiences. He was willing to elope. I think that his youthful experiences have shaped him because he's seen how much misery and suffering and poverty and the miserable situations that the people that he knew and loved have ended up in. Eliza died miserable. His brother probably died miserable. His father probably died equally dissatisfied with his lot. When you look at it that way, I don't really think that we should be as surprised as we think we should that Marianne finds that quite attractive. As the novel says, she found herself at 19 submitting to new attachments, entering on new duties, placed in a new home, a wife, the mistress of a family, the patroness of a village. She becomes Mrs. Brandon. As Jane Austen points out, Marianne could never love by halves, and her whole heart became in time as much devoted to her husband as it had once been to Willoughby. We can finally complete the last elements of the family tree, which I think draws a nice tidy conclusion to it all, really.